Combattants de l'indépendance, aujourd'hui victorieux, je vous salue au nom du gouvernement congolais. À vous tous, mes amis, qui avez lutté sans relâche à nos côtés, je vous demande de faire de ce 30 juillet 1960 une date illustre que vous garderez ineffaçablement gravée dans vos cœurs, une date dont vous enseignerez avec fierté la signification à vos enfants.
This is Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba was the first democratically elected prime minister in the history of what was then known as the Republic of Congo, later as Zaire, and now as the Democratic Republic of Congo. This speech was delivered on June 30th, 1960, the day Congo finally won independence from Belgium, ending what has come to be known as one of the most brutal, inept episodes of colonial rule to occur anywhere in the world. Shortly after independence, however, the provinces of Katanga and South Kasai attempted to secede from the country. Lumumba appealed to the United States and the United Nations for help in combating the Belgian-supported Katangan secessionists. Neither took him up on their request. So Lumumba did what one did during the Cold War. He turned to the Soviet Union for help. By the end of 1961, Lumumba would be ousted from power, detained by the Congolese military, which by then was under the control of Mobutu Sese Seko, and ultimately executed by firing squads as officials from Katanga looked on. The whole affair had been orchestrated, supported, and facilitated by Belgian agents and the CIA. Why was Lumumba so threatening? Why were the Soviet Union and the United States so interested in the affairs of a couple breakaway provinces with a total population the size of Denver metro area in the middle of sub-Saharan Africa? The answer is copper. From Salvador Allende and copper-exporting Chile to Lumumba and copper and uranium-rich Zaire, and Mohammad Mossadegh in oil-rich Iran, the historical record is littered with U.S. and Western and Soviet involvement in, or at least support for, coups against elected leaders whose political platforms and policies threatened Western, and primarily US and UK, access to strategic natural resources. Strategic resources are the raw materials, mostly metals, but also some forms of fuel, that are necessary for building and supplying and deploying modern militaries and securing the viability of the economies on which those militaries depend. Let's take, for example, the USS Zumwalt, a 610-foot, $4.3 billion investment in the U.S. Navy's dominance of the maritime space. This thing is incredibly complex and incredibly expensive. The shells designed to be fired by its main gun cost roughly $1 million per. To say it's high-tech is a real understatement. Now, what goes into crafting something like this? Well, clearly a lot of engineering, but also steel, which is a mixture of iron and chromium, aluminum, which is made from bauxite, and a bunch of copper and titanium and other rare earth metals. Many of these things are not available, or at least not very abundant in the United States, so they have to be sourced from abroad. For example, nearly half the world's uranium is mined in just 3 countries, Kazakhstan, Namibia, and Niger. And the need to source them from abroad is not unique to the United States or to the UK. It's the case for Russia as well. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union jockeyed for influence and control over countries with large exportable supplies of these resources. This map from the 1950s illustrates U.S. concerns quite clearly. It even continued into the post-Cold War era. Among the shifting justifications for the U.S.-led coalition's invasion of Iraq, and Iraq's earlier invasion of Kuwait, was and has been the control of oil.
Despite previously being adamant it wasn't a reason for going to war in Iraq, the federal government now says oil is one of the reasons Australian troops are staying there. Launching the government's latest defence update, the Prime Minister says energy security, including oil, is something Australians need to think about when considering the consequences of a premature withdrawal from Iraq.
First, it was about weapons of mass destruction. Then it was terrorism. Now, oil has become a reason for the war in Iraq.
Obviously, the Middle East itself, not only Iraq, but the entire region, is an important supplier of energy, oil in particular.
Today, the Prime Minister launched Australia's latest defence update, and securing oil supplies from the trouble region is highlighted as justification for staying the course.
Many of the key strategic trends I have mentioned, including terrorism and extremism, challenging demographics, WMD aspirations, energy demand and great power competition converge in the Middle East.
It wasn't always the way.
Prime Minister, has oil got anything to do with this conflict?
No, I don't believe for a moment it has.
I think Mr Howard makes it up as he goes along on Iraq. When Mr Howard was asked back in 2003 whether this war had anything to do with oil, Mr Howard said, in no way did this war have anything to do with oil.
The entry of oil into the argument has Labor redoubling its calls for an exit strategy. But the government is adamant there will be no timetabled withdrawal.
The Australian Labor Party is out of step with what is right and necessary to do in Iraq.
In a further sharpening of differences on foreign policy, Kevin Rudd has released his own blueprint, with the focus fixed firmly on the Pacific.
Unless we embrace a new strategic approach, the reality is that the long-term drift in Australia's national security interests in the Southwest Pacific will only get worse.
Mr Rudd wants aid to the Pacific almost doubled to 0.5% of GDP.
Unless we attend to the long-term human capital development of regional states, we will face insurmountable problems across the rest of the development and security agenda.
The government set a course to double aid spending by 2010, but that would still be short of Kevin Rudd's target. Connor Duffy, ABC News, Canberra.
Presently, concerns about competition over strategic resources are resurfacing, fueled by the economic rise of China. Growing consumption of natural resources, particularly energy and metals, is the handmaiden of industrialization and economic development. Even among rapid industrializers, however, China's voracious demand for energy and other strategic resources is pretty unprecedented. China's rapid industrialization has been more energy and metals intensive than that of either Brazil or South Korea, other very famous examples of emerging industrializing economies. Now, as China has become a major resource importer, its economic growth and large current account surpluses have fueled a lot of scrutiny over its foreign affairs. Now, China has been a major power throughout the post-World War II era, with a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. But it was the least economically integrated of the permanent members until its rapid economic ascent in the early 1990s. This rapid, outward-oriented growth has both facilitated and necessitated a large increase in China's military spending. As China's global economic ties deepen, its national interests increasingly require the ability to project force on a more than regional scale. And even if China were not so heavily invested in extractives, its dependence on natural resources sourced from abroad compels it to invest in significant military capacity in order to secure the supply lines and keep those materials coming in. So, there are very clear geopolitical concerns, that is, concerns related to the projection of force abroad, as shaped by geography, in this case specific deposits of natural resources, at play here. One obvious concern is that a return to Cold War-like competition between the US and China will lead the two to clash openly over these resources, a large-scale resource war. But other concerns revolve around the effects for natural resource-rich countries themselves. The resource curse is the tendency for countries with large endowments of valuable mined resources to have lower levels of development, weaker political and economic institutions, and be less democratic, more corrupt, and plagued by civil conflict than their non-resource-rich counterparts. This is for a variety of reasons. One of them is the aforementioned external meddling, but the most fundamental is actually more basic. Absent these resources, the only way for rulers of these societies to grow their economies is to invest in their most fundamental resource, humanity, building their human capital through investments in education and health to ensure a competitive, vibrant workforce. And they have to bargain with the citizens to do it. They need to exchange public services for the right to tax those citizens. And because those citizens would be taxed, they would want representation. We owe industrialization and the rise of modern democracy in no small part to the fact that the rulers of early modern Europe had to bargain with the societies that they governed over revenue.
25 luxury cars which were confiscated from the son of the president of Equatorial Guinea have been auctioned off in Switzerland. The sale, including Lamborghinis, Ferraris and Rolls-Royces, raised $23 million for social projects in Equatorial Guinea. It's part of a deal reached with Swiss prosecutors to drop an investigation into misuse of public funds in the African nation.
Now, if you can get extravagantly wealthy exporting raw materials, and have major powers willing to intervene to prop you up anytime the populace gets restive, why bother with all that hard work? Seems kind of exhausting, right? I'd probably just hire some ex-Mossad or Spetsnaz bodyguards, deal directly with multinational firms, and hang out drinking $1,000 bottles of scotch on my yacht. As with oil-producing states and territories in the 20th century, countries with large endowments of these strategic resources will see their geostrategic significance increase markedly, potentially mirroring Cold War competition to secure access to strategic resources during the 20th century. These dynamics may be underpinning part of the scramble for the Arctic, with China investing heavily in rare earth mining capacity in Greenland. Observers are mixed in their assessments of the degree to which Chinese interest in the Arctic relates more to mining or to navigation rights, but those two objectives can and likely do coexist. The effects of this geopolitical competition will not be uniform across mineral-rich states. For major powers with dominant positions in certain metals, like China in rare earths, for which it accounts for about 71% of global output, this dominant position will provide considerable strategic leverage to threaten and/or actually ban exports, as China has done in the past. This is a substantial potential lever for trade disruption and retaliation. However, many countries with large reserves of transition metals, like Guinea in the case of bauxite, or the Democratic Republic of Congo in the case of cobalt and copper, face internal conflicts, migration pressures, and environmental stresses, and have comparatively weak institutions to manage these stresses. To the extent that transition metals are sourced from contexts already rife with political instability, and the strategic significance of these metals increases due to forecast increase in demand for them as a result of energy transitions, U.S. national interests may be adversely affected, even if these rare earth materials and other materials are not rare in the geological sense and can be recycled. This implies a role for increased exploration effort in the United States and in reliable allied countries, as well as a conservation and recycling effort to be started at home. This lecture has discussed the geopolitics of natural resources and resource wars, as well as some of the ways natural resource wealth can lead to worse development and governance outcomes. Now, what do you think? Will the transition to renewable energy sources mean an end to the resource curse? Or will these dynamics simply shift to a different set of countries and natural resources?